Turn your slides up.
Um,
Do an introduction.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. I was like, let me get it. All right, so we will get started. Welcome to one of a series of webinars that we'll be hosting from the J Center, as we call it, or the Gender Center for Innovative Higher Education. My name is Leonard Taylor. I am the director of the Higher Education Redesign Program and one of the many J Center team that you'll be interacting with if you choose to continue in watching the webinar series that we've put together for Innovative Practice. Today, we'll go over a number of topics specifically focused around design thinking and design thinking in higher education context. So pull up some slides here. All right, so at any given time throughout, if you have questions, feel free to chat them in. We have Aaron Conkle here, who is the managing director, that'll be fielding some questions for us and making sure that we get to them throughout the course of this 45 minutes. So feel free to ask whatever questions you like. Also, I'll apologize in advance. I am battling a cold, hopefully on the tail end of that. So if I sound a little nasally or if you hear me hack something up, not a part of innovation or design thinking, just me trying to be better. So.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Next one, I'm sorry. So just to start at some outcomes that we kind of set for this particular session, or things that we want hopefully you to get out of your time with us. One, to develop an understanding of design thinking as a change strategy. So really introducing you to the concept of design thinking and also understand how this concept can be used or leveraged, or how it operates in a way to kind of create innovation and stimulate change in particular environments. Two, to explore the utility of design thinking for higher education contexts. So design thinking is something that's been around for a while and has been used interdisciplinarily in a number of industries, but is new to higher education, relatively new to higher education. And so looking at how design thinking fits in a higher education context, and what are some of the contextual nuances that one should consider when thinking about applying design thinking to higher education challenges. Three, identifying potential applications of design thinking at your particular institution. So I would invite you or challenge you to think, as we go through these particular steps, what things are challenges that we face at our particular institution in your particular role in the work that you're doing, what challenges you might have or see as emerging as student populations change, as pressures on institutions change, and what ways do you think design thinking could be leveraged to that end? And I'll definitely be interested in any questions that come out as you think about potential challenges. And then four, identifying lingering questions or muddy points when considering design thinking for the institution. So, you know, one of the things that design thinking is helpful for is to really kind of remove the barriers that we sometimes let get in the way of us creating our best and most innovative thoughts and ideas. But we want to circle back to that at the end to make sure that we do identify some of those structural or cultural or political challenges that are very real and do impede the work that we do. So it's not that we're getting rid of those things, but we want to put them to the side. But so definitely think about what those challenges are and bring those forth as questions as they come. So first, what is design thinking in higher education? So we'll start with the design thinking piece. So here's a quote from Tom Fisher, who is one of our design associates and also the former dean of the College of Design here at the University of Minnesota. In a book that he wrote, In the Scheme of Things, wrote, "In a world with little respect for traditional structures, almost everything from operation of a company to the organization of a community can be approached as a design problem." And so one of the things that we really believe at the J Center, that I really believe in working with the Higher Ed Redesign Program, is that everything is a process that can be designed, and everything designed can be improved. And so this is an opportunity for us to figure out whether it's formal structures, whether it's cultures, whether it's processes at your institution, how can we apply design thinking to help improve them and make them better for the people who have to navigate them. So design thinking is a process that has many aspects to it, but in particular, it involves problem definition, field research, idea generating, storyboarding, frequent prototyping and narrative, to overall engage participants and motivate action. So when we talk about problem definition, we're really thinking about how are we understanding the problem, field research. So although the design process is user oriented, we still want to draw on traditional policy and traditional scholarly research to inform the work that we do. Idea generating here, I mean, we could talk about brainstorming, but it's really coming up with ways to stimulate creativity for those that are generating ideas and removing barriers so that people can generate ideas more freely. Storyboarding, so we can actually take those ideas and put them into kind of a trajectory. And then also frequent prototyping and narrative. So overall, the design thinking process is iterative. And so we want to make sure also that we're building things, that we're trying things, that we're testing things, and that we're engaging people and motivating action. This is an action-oriented fail-forward process. And so we want to make sure that at the forefront, we're focusing on that iterative and engaging piece of what design thinking is. So there are a number of different models or ways to visually or pictorially convey what design thinking is. Virajita Singh, one of our other design associates working through a faculty in the College of Design, decides to articulate it in this way to highlight the iterative nature. What I'm going to do is walk through step by step what each of these stages is and give a little bit of context as far as how they're important to the process. The first step is empathy. Empathize with users in the system. It's really important and at the core of what we do in design thinking to focus on the people that will actually be using or exposed to whatever the products or processes that we seek to create. And so far too often we use research solely, or we decide to rely on people's opinions or experiences solely without really getting in contact with and getting feedback from and input from the people that will actually be using our particular solutions or approaches. In a higher education environment, users could be students. So if we're designing a new advising approach, then users would be students. In our environments, the users could be other employees. So sometimes design thinking could be used to reconfigure different processes, administrative processes in the institution as well. So users in this case could be a variety of folks, but it's whoever is going to be using or the beneficiary of the particular solution that's being created. Step 2, define. Also, what we find is that we don't often spend enough time understanding what the problem is and being sure that our understandings of the problem are congruent. And so the second step in the process around definition is really to deepen our understandings of the problem from our own perspectives, from policy perspectives, from scholarly perspectives, and also from user perspectives based on built off of step 1. And also to make sure that our understandings are congruent and consistent across all of the folks that are working to coordinate a solution or collaborate in that solution. We found in our work in the J Center, and I'm sure you may have found in some of your times as practitioners, as have I, in previous roles, where we get to building out a solution, and then at the last step before implementing a solution, we realize that not everybody understood the problem in the same way. So that the product itself, isn't working for some as it's working for others because we had different conceptions of what the actual problem was. So step 2, the definition is really important for us moving forward toward a solution. Step 3, ideate. So we want to make sure to generate an abundance of ideas so that we have the most and best ideas to work from. This step is often the most challenging in the environments that we work in because idea generation, brainstorming, those types of things are often looked at as, there's a fine line. And so you could go down this endless line of we're coming up with all these ideas and not moving toward action. And one of the things with design thinking, we have a bias toward action. So we want to make sure that we're productive in our ideation. But often the ideas that we generate are couched within, are limited by other institutional factors, political factors, resourcing. And so the ideas that we come up with are already confined by the context that we're working within. And so what we do in design thinking is a number of strategies. We leverage improv and other creative and performing arts to challenge people to get in mindsets that help them more creatively and more abundantly generate ideas that could be used to develop solutions. The next step is the prototype. So again, one of the steps that of these steps, one that is sometimes overlooked in organizations, particularly in higher education, is how do we build something to scale? And how do we test that in a variety of ways before we move things into action? And so I've been a part of projects where we have leveraged lots of really good, really quality research to inform our work, and built very impressive, very comprehensive and complex programs or systems to serve students in a particular way, for example. But what we did not do was spend enough time prototyping and testing different iterations of what our solution could be to learn from the actual prototype, the actual samples in different ways. And so then we find ourselves going through phase 2 or a 2.0 version of a program, or a 2.0 version of a particular solution, when we could have done a lot of that iteration in the design phase. So step 4 is really for us to say, let's take our ideas from paper, let's actually build them out into working models, whether that be an actual model physically, or whether that be a sample app, something that could be used to kind of model and demonstrate what it is that the solution that you're creating, so that you can ultimately test it with the users in this case, which is the next step. Test. So I like to talk about or think about this as fail forward feedback. And so moving forward from prototype to test is not about getting the right answer. It's about getting the wrong answer in the best way, and learning as much as possible from that. So one of the appreciative pieces of design thinking is that it's not trying to get the right answer. Again, it's about seeing all of the brilliance that we can get from all of the things that we learn from whatever we have, whether or not that turns out to be the final solution. And so in the test phase, we actually expose students in a particular case, or institutional members, whoever the users are, to whatever our prototype is. If it's a usable model, we have them use it. If it's not a usable model, we invite feedback and opinions and perspectives, sometimes going back to the empathy approach and getting, interviews and collecting data in that way around what people think the utility of this particular solution is, what challenges will people have, and when people actually work through it, to see what challenges do they report. Collecting that data and that feedback, and then going back to our prototype, going back to the solution that we created, and continuing to iterate until we find a workable solution that accommodates the users in the best possible way. And then the last step, which isn't represented in the model, but is an important part of the step, is really just repeat. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to revisit and restart the process. It's designed and intended to be iterative, because we know that we don't want to be arrogant enough to assume that what we create first, it will be the best thing that we create. And so knowing that we'll revisit the process at any time in the process is important. And also it relieves a lot of pressure on the folks that are working to create solutions, because at any given time you can go back and look at what we're doing to see if it's working, that nothing is set in stone, and that we can kind of revisit things if we need to, if we find some kind of hiccups along the way. So one of the other important things, or several important things about design thinking, are the assumptions that are rooted in what we do in the design thinking. So what I just walked you through was kind of the steps that we use to promote design thinking, the steps that we take folks through in promoting the design thinking process, but I'm going to walk through 8 assumptions that are helpful for us in helping people understand why design thinking is important. First is embracing diversity in all forms. And so when we talk about diversity in all forms, part of it is the constituents or how the team is constituted, or the folks, the actors, the stakeholders that are working to create a particular solution. And so what social identities are represented, what perspectives or places in the institution are represented, what positions in the actual solution are represented. So do you have folks that are facilitating the solution that are a part of it, like maybe administrators or staff? Do you have students that are going to be a part of the process if students are the users? Do you have, community members if there's some type of tie or impact on the community in a particular way? So making sure that the people that are a part of the process are diverse in a variety of different ways in social identity and positioning and how they experience the particular solution. The second is radical collaboration. And this is probably, I would argue, the hallmark of design thinking. In higher education, as we've come to experience over time, as I've experienced, is that collaboration can be limited and sometimes stifled by a lot of environmental factors, a lot of political factors, and sometimes resource factors like time and money. And what we try to do in design thinking is stimulate the most radical and out-of-the-box collaboration that we can to see what brilliance comes from these new configurations and collaborations of people. So when we're thinking about radical collaborations, who are the 2 people that exist in a particular system that both use the system in a particular way, but would never otherwise interact? And what brilliance, what great thoughts and ideas could come from them working together toward a solution. So when we talk about radical collaboration, it's about bringing those folks together. The third part, and this relates to the prototyping piece, is about making things visible, or making things tangible, or making things or representing things in the physical space in the world. By engaging different parts of our brain, by engaging in different modalities, we get the opportunity to think differently because we're actually working and doing differently. Too often in our work, we operate in very 2-dimensional or electronic spaces. I know here at the University of Minnesota, we do a lot of collaborative work through Google Documents, which is fantastic. But most of our collaboration happens through Google Documents. So what are some other ways that we can challenge ourselves to sometimes meet in a physical space or leverage technology in a different way to make the ideas that we're working on, to represent them in more than just 2-dimensional spaces? Number 4 goes back to the first point in design thinking, which is empathy, having empathy for the user. And I like to talk about this in my work as an unapologetic user focus. How are we being sure to think about the needs and prioritize the needs of the people that we're creating solutions for? Now, that can be challenging in these environments because we know that the solutions that we create have a variety of impacts and implications for different stakeholders. So something that we create for students, for example, I keep going back to the student example because I have a background in student affairs, that, what we do for students affects students, and it also affects budgets when it comes to enrollment, and it also affects retention rates, which might have to do with funding, and it also affects the public image of the institution depending on the populations of students that you're serving. There are lots of implications, but what we want to say is that ultimately in all of those things, we want to consider all of those things, but prioritize the user experience first. 5 is something that when we do our work in the J Center, we have to work the most to build in the people who are going through design thinking processes, is having creative confidence. I remember being a kid and thinking that my art was the best. Was it? Probably not. But it was something about my life at that point that allowed me to be confident in whatever I created. And somewhere along the line in navigating institutions, I had lost that. And so design thinking seeks to bring back in the creative confidence, to believe in the power and the quality of the ideas that come out before submitting them to the larger world to be kind of challenged and troubled. 6, having a bias toward action. Now, I talked about number 4 as being one of the or number 2, excuse me, as being one of the hallmarks. But number 6 is very, very important to what we do. Having a bias toward action, focusing on failing forward, which is the next step. So I'm forecasting a little bit, but just really being oriented around how can we put things to action as soon as possible? How can we get a minimum viable product to move forward so that we can get as much feedback as possible in the prototyping and test phase so that we can go back to iterate and create another generation of the solution that could be the best for whoever our users are. 7, being open to failing forward. And the key here is openness to failing forward. Sometimes because we work in politicized environments that are often restricted by resources, you know, we try to do the best that we can with one shot. We want to create one program or one magic bullet that needs to serve the needs of as many people as we can. Instead of, you know, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, we want to kill 10 with a pebble. And higher education environments have kind of forced us into that mindset. But part of the implication of that is we become very risk averse. And so design thinking seeks to challenge us to be more open to maybe not looking at failure, reducing failure from the overall trajectory of a project, to being open to failing or making mistakes or not having the perfect answer or the best answer during these small iterations to ensure the long-term success and sustainability of a project, the longevity of a project. So being open to failure in smaller increments during the iterative phases to ensure long-term success. Which leads to the last point, which is committing to iterative action. And so even if you feel like you've gotten the best possible solution out of your first phase of development, how do you continue to challenge? How do you continue to collect feedback to get more information from users to see how things could be improved, and incorporating that iterative piece, making the iterative action a part of the culture of a particular office or a particular department that's taking on design thinking, so that that iterative approach becomes a reflex versus a reaction. So with that, that's kind of a very broad overview of design thinking. I want to pause to make space for any questions that folks have.
Leonard, we have a question. How do you identify radical partners to get them involved?
That can be a challenge. And so when we think about radical partnerships, it's hard you don't know what you don't know. So if there are people that you haven't worked with, how do you know who will be the best? But what I found is that radical collaboration can be stimulated in great ways through those empathic interviews. So in the first step of the design process, when you're talking to users, asking users questions that help to understand what other perspectives or what other considerations that they may have. So when I think about some of the examples, the example that Aaron and I were actually chatting about at a school in Florida that, you know, went to this model of moving advising from centers and buildings on campus to empty booths in parking structures, because that was, you know, open space, viable space that could be used. But all of that, you know, and this is just from the brief, the article that I read about it, but a lot of that came from design thinking, and it came from thinking about how do we bring advising from the center of campus, which is hard to get to for students, to the kind of periphery. So the radical collaboration in that particular example was, well, let's talk to Parking and Transportation Services about, you know, if we could use this space and what it could be used for. And so again, I think when we think about the user focus, when we explore the user's needs, then we start to identify institutional stakeholders who might have some interest or might have some weight in, you know, getting students particular resources if the students are the users in this case, you know, other institutional folks who might have some type of knowledge or information that they can share. So a lot of that radical collaboration, I think, can be stimulated when we really sit and listen to the users in our particular situations to figure out what it is they need or what challenges that they're having. Should we move forward? All right. So we talked a lot about design thinking, and design thinking, again, is something that has been used extensively in the healthcare field to think about how they deliver patient service, and in a variety of other fields. And so what makes it unique to higher education is what I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing on right now. Some of these things will sound familiar because I've been kind of touching on them throughout, but I can't emphasize them enough for their utility in higher education. So when we think about higher education and we think about our environments, there are lots of critique about higher education and lots of apprehension about the trajectory of higher education moving forward. Where will we be based on the changing needs of the world, based on the changing profiles of students, based on the changing dispositions of state and federal government toward higher education? All of these things are turning into this, this crucible, if you will, that higher education administrators and leaders are trying to figure out how can we serve everybody with decreasing and shrinking resources. One of the challenges in that situation is we also have to make those decisions in some very rigid institutions who have operated for hundreds of years with very similar structures. Now, there are institutions within the landscape of higher education that have more agility, but we see currently that the trends are that the institutions who demonstrate more agility in a variety of different areas are the ones that are gaining the ascendancy, at least in public attention around innovation in higher education. So when we think about design thinking, part of it is figuring out how can we start to trouble the structures that are getting in the way for us to continue to emerge and improve our institutions in higher education. And that really ties back to what we do in the J Center, with our mission being to disrupt, engage, and inspire. How are we disrupting old ways of thinking and knowing in favor of new ways of doing to support change in higher education? So when we think about this, the 4 points that come to mind that really make design thinking in higher education unique, the first part is the focus on the user and not only the system. Too often we focus on the system of higher education because so much of our work, particularly as administrators, is focused on navigating the system, maintaining the system, and updating the system. The users get lost. We hear those narratives from students in an abundance of research. When we talk about students, I'll use University of Minnesota as an example, a huge Research One institution where there might be certain populations of students that have the propensity to feel disconnected, for example. And so we have an abundance of resources on campus to get them connected, whether it's through housing or whether it's through advising or different disciplinary or social identity specific programs. But those programs are created because at some point the institutions have lost focus on the users, which are students in that particular case. So whatever the design project is, whatever the challenge is, not just focusing on higher education as a system, but focusing on the individual people that we're seeking to create solutions for. Again, it could be students, it could be community members that we're seeking to serve, especially if you're a land-grant institution really wanting to develop that public engagement. It could be employees at a particular in a particular department that we're wanting to create solutions for. But whatever it is, not only focusing on the system, but also not ignoring the system, prioritizing the users, but taking the user and the system together to figure out how to move forward. The second piece, specific to higher education, and I alluded to this before with some of the rigidity of higher education institutions, is to bring much needed change and redesign to the system of higher education. And so a lot of the congruence across higher education is because we look to each other for best practice. We look to other institutions to see how they're doing things, or if they're serving this population of student a little bit better than we are, how can we learn from them? Collaboration is built into higher education in a variety of different ways, but now we need to figure out how to be leaders and collaborators toward change. And so particularly within higher education, it's thinking about the nuances or the things that make higher education institutions unique. Faculty is one thing that comes to mind. So, in design thinking in the private sector, change happens very differently and decisions are made very differently and power sits in different places in those institutions. Well, in higher education, there are faculty, there are administrators, there are community stakeholders. If you're, depending on your institution, there might be some governing board that also has some influence, some state and federal influence based on the institution, accreditation. There are lots of different pressure points that we need to consider. And so part of us doing design work in higher education is bringing change, but also considering and taking into account in a thoughtful way what those pressure points are. The third point is transforming our higher education institutions into hubs of relevant creativity. So not just figuring out how to navigate some of the challenges or some of the structural barriers that we face, but how do we make higher education institutions home for creative work? Our institutions house so much social, political, and intellectual capital, but we haven't figured out at all of these places how to break down the barriers and the structures that stop us from having creative and productive conversations across discipline. So one of the things about the Redesign program is that we're an interdisciplinary initiative between the J Center here in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota, the College of Design at the University of Minnesota, and the Midwest Higher Education Compact. And we work collectively and collaboratively to break down some of those structures to really stimulate interdisciplinary work, which design thinking for higher education is truly an interdisciplinary endeavor. So how do we not only break down structures, but create a generative place for creativity in higher education? And then the fourth point is focused on timely on-the-ground impact. One of the challenges in higher education is that there are people in the institution now, whether those be students as users, whether those be people as users. There are people here now that are being impacted by our innovation or lack thereof. And so what we want to do when we talk about failing forward, when we talk about iteration, is being able to move as swiftly as possible toward solutions that can start as early as possible to improve the experiences of whoever those users are we focus on. So with all of this being said, and this very quick overview of design thinking and some nuance to design thinking in higher education, there are two things that I would offer those that are really interested in moving forward with design thinking. Now, the J Center website, which we'll show you in a slide after this, is a great place to look for more scholarship. There are a number of things that are coming out of the office from our faculty director and others around different applications of design thinking and some studies that have been published based on the work that we've already done in the J Center. But the two things that I would offer for those that are considering that I think are the most useful and probably the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to figuring out how to start to incorporate design thinking into your work now is, number one, having an unapologetic user focus. And I alluded to this earlier. But too often we make excuse for not being able to accommodate a particular user for a particular reason, as opposed to taking those things into consideration. So, the conversations that I'll have might be, well, our goals for admissions just sometimes really impede our diversity goals. These are the things that sometimes come up in conversations. And there are lots of things that, lots of directions that you can go in that conversation. But how do we, instead of juxtaposing these things, start to prioritize the user experience and take these other things as consideration? So instead of figuring out instead of figuring out why they don't work together, focusing on how they can work together. So with that unapologetic focus on the users or making the users a priority. The second piece is radical collaboration. Again, I mentioned a little bit from one of the questions that came up about how empathy and that step in the design process can be used to stimulate collaboration, but also collaboration isn't just limited to the actual creation of the solution. We know in institutions like higher education and other social enterprises that radical collaboration can be something as simple as, here are the people who I know at the institution in different areas. So, stimulating radical collaboration can also be leveraging social capital that you already have in the institution or across institutions to create meaningful change and innovative work. So these are the two things that we would offer as things that you could potentially practice and start on now, even in some of the work that you're doing that might not be fully oriented around design thinking. These are two things that you can take from design thinking and start applying in your work today or tomorrow in your meeting later on this afternoon. So with that, I think we'll go to we'll go to the final slide, which is just the JCenter website, and then we'll also open up to any questions that are emerging from the group.
So I have a couple of questions. One is, can you give a couple more tangible examples of design thinking in practice? And one of the things I was thinking about is the design process that you went through as a design associate.
For sure. So one of the things that we built the program off of is a 2013 pilot that we did where we brought in stakeholders across, we brought in folks to address the issue of cost, quality, and access in higher education. And so there were 18 folks that are brought in across industries from the Twin Cities. So there were faculty, there were folks from nonprofit agencies, there were folks from the private sector. So, you know, some security folks from Target, some folks from 3M, and then also students. There were also graduate students. So I was a part of that initial program. And what we did over the course of the design project was we looked at how to apply open educational resources, which are basically open source, the trend toward open source resources, whether that be text, whether that be MOOCs, like massive online open courses, you know, access to knowledge, basically that's not, that is free, but also not tied to a particular degree program or credential. How do we use open educational resources to address issues of quality, of access, quality, access, and I just lost the last part, I'm sorry, and affordability in higher education. And what that led to was 3 very different solutions that all pointed in the same direction. Each of the 3 teams of 6 came up with and developed a solution that focused on not creating new programs and new processes, but figuring out ways to leverage the current programs and processes that existed in higher education. So more specifically, the program that I worked on looked at how can we take what industry contributes, what communities need, what higher education institutions offer through credentialing, and how can we align those better such that a user does not have to go through a 4-year degree program to get a credential and then move into an industry where they eventually have to be trained again. And so we talked about things like apprenticeship and how we can place those things in more strategic places to make the experience more streamlined and efficient. So in this particular application of design thinking, it wasn't necessarily even creating something new, it was just reorganizing systems that already existed. One of the fun things that kind of came out from that is that at the end of the design thinking process, we presented to the annual meeting for the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, which is about 14 state legislators and higher education officials that came to Minnesota to kind of look at what we had done. We presented in a Shark Tank style pitch. And one of the initiatives that were created, which was the project that I was working on, a version of that is actually being applied in the state of Minnesota right now under the leadership of one of our state legislators to focus on stimulating workforce in higher education by realigning stakeholders, or stimulating workforce in Minnesota by realigning stakeholders, including higher education. So we're starting to see very tangible applications, not just in creating programs, but also in reorganizing systems and processes.
So another question, how do you get buy-in from the stakeholders on your campus?
I think that's another robust challenge that we face in higher education institutions, again, with limited time resource and limited financial resource, but it's inclusion in the process. One of the things that I think design thinking really does well is by bringing folks into the process, even in discussing what the process could be of design thinking, you're starting to cultivate buy-in between amongst people who would potentially either participate themselves or send representatives to participate in the process. And so because it is so open and so iterative, part of cultivating buy-in is the fact that people can enter and exit at any point. And so it's not as restrictive as some commitments to working on a task force or a committee, for example. And because it's iterative, sometimes you'll have a certain amount of folks that are a certain constituent of folks that are a part of the process, and we realize that you need another voice, or one of the voices in that group, or one of the perspectives in that group is less useful or less necessary, and there's flexibility in the process so that people feel like they can buy in, but also that what they're contributing is used and useful.
Leonard, if we want to hear more about this, or perhaps see you present in the future, are there opportunities for that?
Yes. So first, quick plug. Again, this particular workshop is a part of the Innovative Practice webinar series that we're hosting in the J Center for Innovative Higher Education here at the University of Minnesota. And so although we've talked about design thinking, a couple other pieces that'll come up. So in February, there's a session led by our faculty director on public engagement, and also a webinar that'll be held by Erin Conkle, our managing director, on strengths-based approaches and appreciative approaches in higher education. And then in March, another scholar, particularly around small liberal arts institutions, is going to do some work around entrepreneurial strategies. And then we'll have someone who will wrap up the webinar series with talking about evaluation. So in general, outside of design thinking, there are lots of other opportunities to engage with some of the innovative work that we're doing in higher ed. Specifically related to design thinking, first and foremost, you can check out the website, because there's lots of useful information on the website and information about the specific things that we have going on as far as scholarship, as well as some videos to talk about what things we're actually doing. And there'll be some more things posted in the next few weeks as we continue to reinvigorate our web presence. Additionally, for those of you who will be traveling to ACPA or NASPA, the J Center will be hosting a redesign session, doing redesign workshops at both of those conferences. So at ACPA, which will be in Montreal from, I believe, the 6th to the 9th, we'll be doing a redesign workshop, as well as in NASPA, that'll be, I believe, the 13th through the 16th, we'll be doing a redesign workshop there as well. So if any of you are traveling to those conferences or know folks that will be at those conferences from your respective institutions, definitely tell them to check out the redesign workshop there, where we'll go in a little bit more depth with the foundational pieces that we talked about today. And we'll also have the time during that workshop to do an actual design challenge, or a mini version of a design challenge, so people can have some hands-on in-practice experience with what the design process looks like.
That sounds great. We want to thank Leonard for presenting. We really appreciate his time. Again, you can catch us at ACPA or NASPA, and hopefully we'll have Leonard back on the webinar schedule at the end of March. Maybe we'll talk through some more tangible examples of design thinking and ways that you can implement it on your campus even further.
Fantastic. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you, Erin, for having me.
Thank you.